Ordinary men and women doing extraordinary things. That's the history of the United Mine Workers of America. They did not ask for greatness or glory, but they achieved it nonetheless. They fought our nation's wars, and then they fought for freedom at home. They built the middle class, and they made it possible for working families to enjoy the fruits of their labor. This is the story of our heroic struggle.
They had to deal at the company store, had to purchase their tools from the company store. They had to buy their food from the company store. They had to live in the company house and pay the company to live in that company house. Their lives were completely controlled and dictated by the powerful coal company they worked for. When a male child turned 7, 8, 9 years old, that child ended up working at the coal mine, picking slate or being a trapper boy.
Miners, most industrial workers were slaves. Coal miners, they went to work when it was dark and they came home when it was dark.
The company valued a mule more than they valued a man. That if you killed the man, it was okay because they could get another one. If you killed the mule, they had to buy one, so they would fire you.
After working 16 hours, miners would get nothing. Because when the company took out of their check the rent, the food, and the supplies, there was nothing left.
They paid you in script, which was company-issued money and wasn't good in public other than in the company town.
They realized that the future was very bleak and dim, so they wanted some way to change their lives. Coal miners who could not speak to one another because they spoke different languages made their way to Columbus, Ohio, and got together in a meeting and formed the greatest union known to man, and they called that union the United Mine Workers of America.
They didn't even speak the same language, everybody, but yet they found a way to connect with each other and exhibit true solidarity and focus on those things that they knew they had in common.
They wrote a constitution that barred discrimination in the areas of race, creed, color, national origin, religion. They understood that when the mine exploded, they all were killed. When people were fired en masse, they all were fired.
The new Miners Union won its first major victory in 1897, when 10,000 union members across the central coal field of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and Pennsylvania went out on strike for better working conditions and wages. 150,000 non-union miners walked out as well. The strike lasted just over 2 months, ending one day after the Latimer Massacre in Pennsylvania, where Luzerne County sheriffs shot into a crowd of hundreds of strikers and their supporters, killing 19. UMWA President John Mitchell negotiated the first national bituminous coal agreement that included the 8-hour day in the contract that ended that strike.
Johnny Mitchell was a pretty extraordinary president. He's the first president in the mine workers to stay for any length of time. He did define for the first time the 8-hour workday.
The anthracite owners refused to agree to the new standard set in the bituminous contract, and in 1902, anthracite miners went out on a 10-month strike. It took intervention by President Teddy Roosevelt to settle that strike, which was the first time the United States government recognized the right of a labor union to represent workers for collective bargaining purposes.
They were casting off their chains, and that's what happens when you hold people in captivity long enough and treat them this way long enough. This is what will happen eventually.
John Mitchell knew that increased competition from coal produced in West Virginia and the Rocky Mountains made it critical for the UMWA to organize those places. Thousands were dying in U.S. coal mines each year. The Monongah disaster killed a reported 367 men, though most now believe more than 500 died in that explosion. Deadly working conditions, combined with slave-like treatment of the miners and their families, led to a strike in West Virginia in 1912.
The miners on Paint Creek had a union, and they came out on strike because of their terrible working conditions and for a new contract. The miners on Cabin Creek, right over the mountain from them, decided to strike also for union recognition. A lot of people were shot, a lot of people died. The coal companies brought in what was known as the Baldwin-Felts Guards. In those days, when you struck, you were not only jobless, you were homeless the day you struck. They kicked you right out of the coal camps.
They used to run a train up and down the track by the tent colony where they had been evicted from their homes, and fire into the colony.
At each labor conflict during this period, Mary Harris, Mother Jones, known as the Miners' Angel, would arrive to give support, courage, and motivation to the striking miners and their families.
So here comes Mother Jones making her appearance, walks up and down Cabin Creek and Paint Creek.
Even though women wasn't allowed into mines till 1974, she was one of our first organizers and a woman that led a lot of organizing campaigns.
She calls for a rally at Cabin Creek Junction, which is right out when you come out of the holler, so to speak. So the Paint Creek and Cabin Creek miners come to here, and supposedly there was about 6,000 people there. And she makes the speech, and in that speech, she criticizes the striking miners for not fighting hard enough. She said, if you want to win this strike, go home and arm yourselves. In 1914, machine gun fire went into the tents of Ludlow, and then those tents were doused with kerosene and set on fire, and 13 women and children were burned alive.
The miners really wanted to organize, and the company officials here did not want them to. So they moved them out of company housing into a tent colony.
We weren't out there for millions of dollars or anything. We just wanted to live and have a job so we could eat. We weren't greedy for anything.
Men, women, and children knew what the costs were going to be, or could be, and they were still willing to make that sacrifice because they wanted more out of life.
I mean, they were all fighting for their lives, not their jobs, not necessarily to get better conditions, but in a bigger picture, they were fighting for each other. They were fighting for their wives and their children. They were fighting for the future of their families, to have something better for the next generation.
The battles in West Virginia did not end in 1913. Conditions for miners remained deplorable. The Baldwin-Felts thugs were a law unto themselves, terrorizing families and communities. But the miners had friends, including the sheriff of Matewan, West Virginia.
Sid Hatfield and others gunned down the Baldwin-Felts Guards in the streets of Matewan. But what most people don't know, the following year, Sid Hatfield was murdered on the courthouse steps in McDowell County in Welch. He and Ed Chambers. And that led to the largest armed insurrection in the history of the United States other than the Civil War. If you can imagine 10,000 armed coal miners marching to hang the sheriff of Logan County. That ended by 1,000 U.S. Army troops getting in between the warring factions. They actually considered this a victory, they being the workers, to get the attention of the federal government, because they just felt that their state government and county government was in the pockets of the coal operators, and in those days that was true too.
Miners in Canada were also fighting to throw off their chains. In Nova Scotia, William Davis led a group of strikers against the British Empire Steel Corporation in 1925 and was deliberately gunned down on June 11th by police. Davis became a rallying cry for the miners in eastern Canada. 6 years later, miners in Saskatchewan went on strike in response to wage cuts implemented by the companies. Police fired into a peaceful demonstration of miners and their families in Estevan, killing 3 strikers.
As much as we complain now about the outrageous things that the government does to us during negotiations or doing organizing drives, it was worse back then. Generally, at that time, an organizing drive was considered an illegal conspiracy. People were harassed, they were brutalized, beaten, and shot for trying to organize a union.
After Blair Mountain, things looked bleak for the Union. But with the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, things changed for working people, and especially coal miners.
They fought until we got the Wagner Act, and then John L. Lewis took that Wagner Act and he told the workers in this country, heed this call that comes from the hearts of men. Organize the unorganized.
John L. everybody looked up to him. And especially, during the Second World War.
We have plenty of aid to give stricken peoples anywhere in the world except in the mining regions of this country.
And he became president in 1919. President for 40 years, most powerful labor leader and probably the most powerful person in this country next to the president.
The workers of this country want representation. They want organization. They want participation. They want protection. They want employment. And they're going to have those things through the leadership and the instrumentality of this new labor movement that you're forging.
So he believed in everybody being in a union. Then he formed District 50, and everybody, retail clerks, taxi drivers, construction workers, you name it, he organized them. And at one time, that District 50 had about 200,000 members of United Mine Workers, none of which were coal miners. And if you want to know where the middle class came from, it came from the right to organize. The right to organize.
Even though Lewis organized tens of millions of workers across the nation, arguably his greatest achievement was the creation of employer-paid health care and the concept of retirement benefits. For the first time, working men and women could live in dignity as they grew old. No longer were workers to labor into their senior years until they were finally broken or died.
The government took over the mines in 1946. Harry Truman administration seized the coal mines. So understand that the United States government had control of the coal industry at the time the health and retirement funds were formed.
If we must grind up human flesh and bones in the industrial machine that we call modern America, then before God I assert that those who consume the coal and you and I who benefit from that service because we live in comfort, we owe protection to those men first, and we owe the security for their families if they die. I say it, I voice it, I proclaim it, and I care not who in heaven or hell opposes it.
He's very tenacious. He really put on a fight for the mine workers. He's going to stay out till John L. Lewis said go back to work. I'll get a contract. We didn't go back until he got a contract.
Knowing we were entitled to lifetime health care, that was the thing that stuck with me the most. That man, he had some power to get Congress and the President of the United States to agree to something like that.
People should understand there were no pensions and no health care. Lewis actually built 10 hospitals in the coal fields with the money from the health and retirement funds. So it was not just something that was beneficial to the miners, it was extremely beneficial to the coal field communities who now had access to health care. Not only UMWA members, but everyone who lived in those communities.
Unionization altered the way in which workers were treated, changing life for millions in the coal fields. Technology altered the job itself. Coal was no longer mined with pickaxes, but with machines. New mining technology allowed for vast increases in coal output, but it came at a terrible price. The machinery produced considerably more coal dust, leading to more explosions and fires, and more miners began contracting black lung. Too much coal dust and lack of government enforcement of mine safety regulations led to large-scale mine explosions, like those in Centralia, Illinois, and Robina, Pennsylvania. Indeed, American and Canadian coal fields are dotted with markers and memorials commemorating the deaths of thousands. The 1968 explosion at Consolidated Coal's Farmington No. 9 mine killed 78 miners, 19 of which are still entombed. It was a terrible tragedy, but it galvanized miners and their families to action.
We were close enough outside that you could see the smoke when Farmington blew up. It blew up twice.
When the mine blew, I heard about it. I was in college. I came home. I just couldn't believe it. I'll never forget, we sat there and we were just waiting for anything. Any news, I could just say, we're just sitting on pins and needles. Just tell us something.
And I watched this on TV, and these widows and kids who lost their fathers, I watched all that on TV, and I watched the mine explode over and over again. They eventually had to seal that mine.
There wasn't a person in our community, and many communities around, and little towns around, that was not affected.
And then the federal government, for the first time in history, passed federal legislation that allowed the federal government inspectors to come into the mines and had teeth in the law, and they could fine the operators and force them to do things they couldn't do before. And in that legislation, you also had the first time you had federal black lung benefits.
In the late 60s and early 70s, the UMWA reorganized. Under John L. Lewis, power in the UMWA was strongly concentrated in the presidency. But as the new generation of miners entered the workforce, they wanted more autonomy and more democracy in the union.
The miners didn't have any say. I mean, the contracts that we got, although we made gains in every contract that we had, but nothing like once we got autonomy.
Joseph Jock Yablonsky decided to take on the Boyle regime.
Why is it time for a change in the administration of the UMW right now?
Because the present administration is totally corrupt and totally concerned with maintaining themselves in office.
After the Yablonsky murders, miners formed the Miners for Democracy movement to take back the UMWA and remove corruption from its leadership.
I'm proud of the honor of heading up a slate of rank-and-file candidates for the international offices for rank-and-file miners.
At the end of the day, Arnold Miller, as part of the Miners for Democracy, ran against Tony Boyle and won in 1972.
The mining industry was not exempt from the social changes sweeping through North America in the 60s and 70s. Women began to enter the mining workforce in large numbers for the first time.
I went to work in the mines to better educate my children, for them to have college and to pay for our home, to help my husband. I think I was the second one in this area in '76. I demanded respect, but I gave respect.
A new age of the UMWA began in 1982 with the election of President Richard Trumka, Vice President Cecil Roberts, and Secretary-Treasurer John Banovic. They understood the shift in the economic and corporate landscape that had occurred with the election of Ronald Reagan in 1980. The government's focus had once again swung away from workers and towards corporate money. The robber barons of old were back in the form of men like Don Blankenship.
Don Blankenship just wanted to break the union. He hates unions. I knew within a month that this guy was a problem then in 1984. 1985, he makes a speech in Huntington. And in that speech, he said if everyone would work for nothing, everybody would have a job, which is absolutely true, but we'd all be slaves, right?
Then the system of retirement health care, built by John L. Lewis in the 1940s, came under attack. In 1989, Pittston Coal forced the issue.
Many of the delegates here went to Pittston. Some were even strikers at Pittston. 4,000 people went to jail. People from all over the United States joined us in that fight. Not only our own members, but other members from different unions.
The dedication and solidarity of the UMWA at Pittston preserved the health care and retirement for workers across the nation.
We have a long and proud history, and we're at our best when we're standing together.
In 1995, Cecil Roberts became president of the UMWA. He immediately reopened the contract, winning wage and benefit improvements. In later contracts, he successfully negotiated the 20 and out and 30 and out pensions. He also secured long-term funding for retiree health care under the Coal Act in 2006. In 2013, President Roberts led the UMWA's successful fight to preserve jobs and retiree benefits in the first Patriot Coal bankruptcy.
Whether we're standing up for people living in poverty and trying to lift them up, whether we're fighting for pensions or health care, those are all things that everybody ought to be standing up for. And you got to be out in the streets, looking people eye to eye, causing corporations and politicians to be as uncomfortable as you can make them, and to show them that we're all in this together.
Because we just don't quit. If you look at what we have accomplished at Pittston, at Patriot, with the Coal Act, these are all things that people thought, there's no way you can be successful. But we were.
We have many challenges and many enemies, but that just makes for a fair fight with the United Mine Workers as far as I'm concerned.